next video.
them. In this episode, we are going to be talking about the Judeo-Christian culture. Okay, so we hear this term very often, Judeo-Christian culture or Judeo-Christian values or history. So in this video, we are going to be unpacking this claim from also a historical point of view.
Before we do this, let me take you back to 637. The scene now is the Muslims are marching under the leadership of the Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab into the gates of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, a city that has been ruled under the Christian rule within the Roman Empire for centuries and centuries. Now let us have a look on this account or this exchange between the Caliph Umar ibn Khattab and Sophonius, the Orthodox Bishop of Jerusalem.
And what I'm going to show you here is a video from Professor Roy Casagranada. He's going to give us a bit of a summary of that historical account.
The Caliph says, I want to see the Temple Mount. And Sophonius goes, why? And the Caliph goes, because it's holy. It's holy to everybody. It's holy to Christians, it's holy to Jews, it's holy to Muslims. And Sophonius goes, nah, we haven't been treating it as holy to anybody. And Umar ibn al-Khattab goes, what do you mean? And so Sophonius says, so after we tore down the second temple of Solomon, when we conquered Palestine, we turned the Temple Mount into a garbage dump to punish the Jews. And the Caliph goes, what do you mean? And Sophonius goes, yeah, there's like 500 years of refuse on that thing. It's just a garbage dump. And he goes, show me. They walk up to the Temple Mount, and the Caliph can't believe what he's looking at. He falls on his knees, and he begins clearing the garbage by his hands. His army sees their leader on his knees clearing garbage, and they run up and they start clearing the garbage themselves. And they clear the garbage off the Temple Mount. The Caliph goes, okay, I want to meet some of the Jews living in Jerusalem. And Sophonius goes, there are no Jews in Jerusalem. And the Caliph goes, what do you mean there's no Jews in Jerusalem? The city is holy to the Jews. How could there be no Jews? And he says, well, us Christians, we pretty much murder them every chance we get. We really hate Jews. In fact, in the war we just did against the Persians, the Jews sided with the Persians. And so we murdered 20,000 Jews in Jerusalem and completely purged the city of its remaining Jewish population. And Umar ibn al-Khattab goes, no, this is wrong. You can't do this. And so he turns to a convert to Islam, a Jewish convert to Islam, and he says, I need you to find me 80 Jewish families that were willing to volunteer to move to Jerusalem so we can reestablish a Jewish presence in this city. And that's how the Muslims conquered Jerusalem. And that's the stuff that's left out of your history books.
So now let's go and let's try to explore more, okay, the Judeo-Christian interactions throughout almost 2,000 years in the recent history of Christianity. So we go back at the time of Jesus, okay, and at the time of Jesus, Jews had different political / ideological or theological sects, okay. So there was a group called the Sadducees and there's another group called the Pharisees, and these two groups were not in agreement. So the Sadducees, they accepted only the written Torah and they rejected the other two categories, the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim. All right? Where the Pharisees, they claimed the Mosaic authority for their interpretation, and they built the foundation of what it became later on the Rabbinic Judaism. Okay, and it extended, as we explained earlier, into the Mishnah, and then later developed into the Babylonian Talmud and the Munich Talmud. Okay, so the Pharisees were often criticized as hypocrites. They clinged to the literal word, and they neglected the spirit of the law. Actually, the Pharisees have, rejected, as we said, rejected Jesus, accused him of blasphemy. They insulted Mary. They called Jesus illegitimate, and they wanted Jesus dead. They saw him as a blasphemer and a threat to the religious authority and teachings. And that's actually why the Quran gives reasons of why the covenant was removed from the Jews, as we explained earlier. One of the things that the reasons why the covenant was removed from them is their boasting. For their boasting, we killed the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, the messenger of Allah, and for the outrageous accusations against Mary herself, and some other practices like taking interest despite of its prohibition, and also for consuming people's wealth unjustly. And then we go then about 30-40 years after Jesus, when this event took place with the Romans destroying the Second Temple, and in 130 AD the Jews try to revolt against the Romans, what is known as Bar Kokhba revolt, but this revolution failed, and then after that Jesus were permanently banned from entering Jerusalem again. The Romans then renamed that land, the land of Canaan, they renamed it to Syria Palestina. It was the Romans who renamed this province into Syria Palestina. This happened under that Emperor Hadrian, and he decided to rebuild Jerusalem as a pagan city, to dedicate it to one of the Romans' gods, Jupiter, and afterwards Jews were permanently banned, as we said, and they had to be scattered around and live in different parts of the world. So we're going to be exploring then this era, of the Jewish history and interaction with the Christian Roman Empire, So when did the Christian Roman Empire actually start? Officially, the Christian Roman Empire lasted from 380 to 1648 AD. So almost its age is about 13 centuries. So it started with this Roman Emperor Constantine, who basically in 313 he issued something called the Edict of Milan, and he granted Christianity a legal status in the Roman Empire. And then by the year 380, Christianity became the official state of or the official state religion of the Roman Empire through this Edict of Thessalonica. This lasted from 380 until the 30 Years' War. So why is the 30 Years' War? This is a war that happened between the Protestant and the Catholics in Europe. It lasted for 30 years between 1618 and 1648. And this war was fought for religious basis, or for religious reasons. And it resulted in the death of almost 9 million people, all inside Europe, So after 30 years of war, there was a treaty called the Peace of Westphalia, that basically this treaty was the only way to put an end to this bloody war. It recognized the sovereignty of the European states, but it officially put an end to the popes and the Catholic Church ability, to dictate the state religion across Europe. So it basically deprived the Catholic Church from its political power, and that was basically and officially the time of the divorce between the state and the church in Europe. So this is just a historical context to show this Christian nation, and what we're going to be exploring now, we are going to explore the interaction of the Jews with the Christian Europe throughout those years from almost 300, we said the 300 AD, the time when the Christian Roman Empire became officially born, and we're going to explore this history all the way until the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. The Jews, after being exiled and being forced out of Jerusalem and banned from entering again, they then split in what is called the diaspora, into distinct regions around the Mediterranean, in South Europe, in East and in Western, in Central and Western Europe, and also in the Middle East, in Babylonia, in Iraq, Iran, Kurdistan, etc., etc. So that gave rise to these new sub-identities, when the Jews then went and started intermingling with those other nations in those different parts of the world. That gave rise to a ethnic sub-identity called the Ashkenazi Jews. And they emerged in the Eastern Europe, and they started speaking Yiddish language, So the Yiddish language is a mix of Middle High German and Hebrew and Aramaic, and have also some Slavic elements in it. This group of Ashkenazi Jews, they faced persecution in the Western Europe, especially after incidents known as the Black Death in the 14th century. Okay, and most of them were forced to migrate eastward. Okay, from Germany, from Western Europe, they had to migrate eastward, and they ended up in Poland. That's why there was a high concentration of Ashkenazi Jews in Poland, and that continued until the Holocaust in 1940s with Nazi Germany. On the other hand, there was also this ethnic sub-identity called the Sephardi, and the Sephardis, they were centered in the Iberian Peninsula, namely in Portugal and Spain. Okay, they developed their own culture there and their own linguistic traditions until they were also exiled later at the 15th century under the Spanish king and queen Ferdinand and Isabella. Okay, where they were forced to leave Spain. And then they had to cross the Mediterranean, and they ended up in North Africa, like in Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, and also some of them chose to go and live in the Ottoman Empire in Turkey. So let's go in a little bit more details, and let's explore these centuries, okay, of interactions between the Christians and the Jews in Europe. So we're going to be exploring about 17 to 18 major expulsions of Jews from Christian Europe. Okay, so the very first major expulsion is known as the Mainz expulsion in 1012. Okay, and we're going to be telling the story all the way until Nazi Germany in 1945. But let's put also some cultural and religious context into this. So before we go and explore this, a reminder that Jews rejected Jesus. Okay, and Christians, they had a tension with the Jews because Christians believed that Jews killed Jesus. Okay, so you can see there was some religious tension that was going on already, okay, between the Jews and the Christians because of Jesus. So when we also look at the Talmudic tradition, okay, we will find that the Talmud contained discriminatory laws towards non-Jews, okay, and that kind of fostered the Jewish isolation, okay, socially towards Christians. So when we look at the Talmud, we see references in the Talmud that show there were separate laws for Jews and non-Jews. Okay, so for instance, usury, okay, or taking interest with non-Jews was allowed in the Jewish tradition, but it was prohibited with Jews. So there was some sort of a double standard when it comes to dealing with Jews and non-Jews. Also, the certain rabbinic interpretations allowed also different treatment, okay, of Jews and non-Jews. And you can see there is some extracts from the Jewish Talmud where you can see it is very disturbing how the Jews in the Talmud, okay, were saying things like that Jews will have slaves of the non-Jews, or basically the Gentiles or the Christians, okay? That the Jews are human, but the Gentiles, and the Gentiles is a broad term that includes all non-Jews, but also specifically includes Christians, okay? That the Gentiles are not humans. So they were this, and we already touched upon this earlier in this video, how this Jewish understanding of the Jewish, essence, that it is different than all other creatures or all other ethnicities, okay? We can see this manifested then in their writings, in the Talmud. We can see an evidence of that they have this supremacy complex, that they are favored, they are God's chosen, they are God's voice to the world, and all other beings are of a less essence, okay? And they consider themselves gods, and all other nations are just a creation of God. And let's actually focus on this idea of the usury, because this actually had some implications and consequences. So the usury practices that were, as we said, prohibited, okay, in Christianity, in the Jewish Talmudic interpretation, it was allowed as long as it happens with non-Jews, okay? But the problem is with this understanding, okay, and this interpretation in the Jewish Talmud, okay, this has fueled the Christian resentment, okay? So the Jews, where they allowed to do this and lend to non-Jews with interest, led some Christian rulers to sometimes legally assign the Jews of the rule of money lenders and tax collectors. And so when we try to summarize these religious and economic aspects, we can look at the Christian mind and the Jewish mind, and we can look at this sort of comparison. So in the Christian mind, Jews were the killers of Jesus. Jews were often associated with usury, tax collection, money lending to Christians. Okay, and these were rules that were bad to Christians themselves by the church law. Also, this bred resentment and fueled accusation of rural murder. So all these ideas that were very famous and very common, that Jews were holding these ritual ceremonies where they suck the blood of children, etc., etc. This was something in the Christian mind, and it fueled this resentment against the Jews. On the other hand, in the Jewish mind, Jesus, the God of the Christians, he was not the Messiah. He was just a false prophet, and they even mocked him and made fun of him, and they called his mother Mary, they called her as adulterous woman. Okay, and for them, Christians were Gentiles, which is some sort of a degrading expression. Okay, it's a condescending expression that is used to kind of like belittle or disrespect someone. Okay, they were considered as pagans, as idol worshippers, and they were not considered as humans. They would be, it is justifiable for them, for the Jews, to enslave them, to enslave the Christians, to rob them, and to murder them. So both these economic motives and religious justifications merged together, leading to 10 centuries of Jewish expulsion from Christian Europe. And that is what we're going to be exploring in this timeline here. So we start with 1012, Mainz, Germany. Okay, so Jews exiled from Germany. And when we say exiled, means there is a political order, there is a political edict, okay, comes from the government that all Jews has to leave the land. Okay, you cannot identify as Jew and live in this country. Okay, and when they say leave, they basically leave their properties behind. Okay, so their properties then become acquired by the government or the state or by the church or whoever claims the right to own this property and wealth and money after that. So we talk about this, you see, Mainz, Germany, then in France it happened in 1182, and then in Germany in almost 1300, and then France, and then again France in 1321. And then you have this incident of the European-wide Black Death massacre. So Jews were blamed for spreading the plague, okay, the massacres, the burning, and they were exiled from towns across Germany, across France, Spain, and Switzerland. It's a very, very, very famous incident in the Judeo-Christian history, okay, where Jews were blamed for everything that happened because of a natural plague, okay, like you blame, people blame certain country for COVID, okay, but imagine that all these people are living in the same country, and you blame them for this, so they become an outcast, and they became hated, and then no people will just treat them, as the enemy. Then you have the 1394, another time France, and then Austria, and then you have the Alhambra decree in Spain, 1492. Another very major event, okay, where Ferdinand and Isabella, two monarchs, two political leaders or king and queen in Spain, they issued this decree, okay, this edict, to expel all Jews who refuse conversion to Catholicism. Okay, so any Jewish person who does not convert to be a Catholic, okay, is forced to leave the land. Okay, and in that time there was a term that appeared. It's called conversos. So conversos was those who became new Christians. So Jews accepting Christianity because they didn't have a choice. Okay, and what happened then is actually this this sort of religious persecution also extended to the Muslims. Okay, so also the Muslims who were living in Spain, in Andalusia at that time, they were also forced either to convert or to be exiled from the land. Okay, and then this expression also appeared called the Moriscos. So the Moriscos were the Muslims outwardly Christians. So they had no choice but to pretend that they are Christians, but they were often still practicing Islam in secrecy. So this is a very major event that actually the Jews and the Muslims were in the same boat. They were both actually persecuted on religious basis by the Catholic Christians in Spain. Moving forward, you have 1496, you have in Portugal, and then you have in some Italian states between 1490 and 700, and then another time also in Naples in Italy, And then you have in Ukraine and Poland, okay, another account of a massacre that happens to the Jews. And then you have in Poland, there was the Poland partition. And then Russia from 1881 all the way, okay, until the 20th century, the early 20th century, Jews were repeatedly and continuously exiled out of Russia. And then the end of this chain, okay, of Christians forcing Jews out of the land, okay, they treating them as second-hand or second-level citizens, okay, ended with the pinnacle of all this expulsion is what happened in Nazi Germany, is the Holocaust. So you clearly see that Europeans were saying this is a Christian continent, all Jews out. From the 11th to the 19th century, Jews faced these waves of expulsion across Europe. The persecution was driven, as we said, by religious hostility, rejection of Christianity, and the Talmudic separateness, okay, also mixed with some economic tensions. By the 18th and the 19th century, Jews gained some civil rights under the Enlightenment reforms, okay? When the Europeans finally, after the fall of the Catholic Church, and then the rise of the thinkers and philosophers in Europe, okay, who brought these new concepts of human rights, etc., they call it the Enlightenment era, okay? This given some sort of, a civil rights to Jews. So Jews gained these rights only after the fall of the Catholic Church in Europe. Okay, it's only when Europe decided to abandon religion that is when the Jews started having some civil rights. Okay, but the problem is this resentment remained. Okay, it was still in the subconscious of all Europeans, because you talk about almost 10 centuries. Okay, 10 centuries of history. You cannot just undo it, like that. So it stayed in the Christian subconscious. Okay, and the Christians became still suspicious about the Jews, even if they given them some sort of civil rights, they stayed suspicious. And as we say, these contradictions gave rise to what was known as the Jewish question. Okay, the Jewish question was, could the Jews ever integrate as equal citizens in Christian Europe? That was the dilemma. That was the question that European Jews, Ashkenazi, Sephardis, kept asking themselves. And this is continued to be the case until one very decisive moment, okay, in this chain of Jewish-Christian interaction. This decisive moment belongs to this guy here. He is a French Jewish army officer. His name is Alfred Dreyfus, if I'm saying his name right. Okay, in the time between 1894 and 1906 in France. So this guy was accused and convicted of spying for Germany. Okay. And during the trial, okay, in the public debate in the court, there was a guy who was sitting there, okay, and he was witnessing these massive crowds shouting, "Death to the Jews, death to the Jews," in the streets of Paris. Okay, this guy is Theodor Herzl, who was then a journalist covering this case. So he listened to those crowds chanting, "Death to the Jews," but he was in his mind that this is happening where? This is happening in the capital of enlightenment in Paris. It's not happening in medieval Europe. Okay? He thought as a Jewish person that we are past this era of persecution, okay, of this treatment of Jewish, and now we are in entitlement. In enlightenment era. So again, we are hearing those chantings means there will never be, okay, a resolution to this problem. Okay? And that basically what led him to author his book, A Jewish State, Solution to the Jewish Question. The whole idea of Zionism, okay, was born because of centuries of Judeo-Christian culture or values. Okay, those Judeo-Christian, if you want to call them really shared values of culture, they were the main reason why someone like Theodor Herzl said, you know what, we need to have a Jewish state, okay, that basically outline a vision for a Jewish homeland. Okay, and then in 1897 he convened that first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, which considered historically as the formal birth of the modern political Zionism. What Theodor Herzl then proposed, okay, as a secular left-leaning nationalist who had nothing to do with any prophecies about, a future Messiah or Mashiach or any sort of like theological or religious background, he proposed a homeland to protect Jews from anti-Semitism. Okay, basically translation from the European Christian persecution of Jews. Okay, and as we said, we're not here to judge, to say that Jews were the victims. As we explained, there was tensions from both ends. The Christians, in their minds, they were looking at the Jews in a certain way, and the Jews also, in their mind, they were looking at the Christians in a certain way. And these two kind of mix it together, and there was some sort of a chemical reaction that resulted in those 11 or 10 centuries, okay, of no harmony whatsoever. It was continuous expulsion, continuous struggle, continuous problems that led to this concept or this question, the Jewish question. So he then proposed this idea of a national home for the Jews, just as a very, we say secular left-leaning nationalist. It was based on nationalism. He was affected by the nationalistic ideologies that appeared after the Enlightenment era in Europe, France, and then this idea of nations coming under certain borders with certain flags, adopting one language and forming a national identity for them. That was the main motive for Theodor Herzl. That's what he wanted to achieve. Therefore, his early ideas did not include any sort of a religious dimension. He even proposed in his very first ideas about this Zionist, homeland or Zionist state, okay, he thought of Uganda and Argentina, okay. His focus was only on the cultural and the national identity, not about the religious identity. However, someone like this person here, Abraham Isaac Cook, okay, received this Zionistic idea or ideology, okay, and then he said that the secular pursuit, okay, of gathering all the Jews together was part of God's plan to redeem Israel. All right. Again, another rabbi, another Jewish rabbi, writing his own interpretation, okay, into a text, and then kind of making that the mainstream ideology and religion for all their followers. Okay, we have seen how this happened in the early days of the Babylonian Talmud, okay, and after the time of Jesus with the Mishnah, okay, when they married together two distant concepts into this idea of future Messiah or Messiah, okay. We've seen this happening again with this guy, Abraham Isaac Cook. So what he did, he then merged Zionism with this idea of the Messianic belief. He said that secular Zionists were part of God's plan to redeem Israel, and then the settlement of the land, okay, will fulfill this biblical prophecy, okay. Therefore, Isaac Cook, considered as the father, one of the fathers of religious Zionism, okay, he then selected that it has to be Palestine, not Uganda, not Argentina. Okay, so he said that the land of Israel has a deep biblical meaning, and then Zion, or the mountain of Zion or Jerusalem, is sacred in the Jewish prayer, and they believe that the homeland must be in the biblical land. So Theodor Herzl went through the time when he was pursuing this idea, this ideology of himself to form a Zionist state, okay, for all Jews to become their homeland. He actually went to the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid, okay, the Turkish or the Ottoman Sultan at that time. We're talking about early 20th century, okay, before the declaration of the Balfour Declaration that was done by the British. He went and he tried to negotiate with Sultan Abdul Hamid, okay, to basically sell him the land of Palestine. Okay, so he wanted to take the land in exchange of a financial support to the empire that was back then crippling under debt. Okay, so he made several attempts to negotiate with the Sultan, including a direct meeting in 1901, and then he offered him 20 million. But these proposals were firmly rejected by the Sultan Abdul Hamid of the Ottoman Empire of Turkey, and he famously stated that he would never sell any part of Palestine as it belonged to the entire Muslim nation and it had been paid for with the people's blood. The British here, and you've got Russia and you've got the Turkish Empire or the Ottoman Empire, and this is where Palestine is. So if you look here, you find that Palestine has this very unique geographical and geopolitical position, okay, between what? Between two big empires or two big nations, which is the Turkish Empire and also the Russian Empire. And the rise of this idea of Zionism or the idea of a Jewish homeland, okay, it did not rise in vacuum, but there was a context that was already made fertile, okay, by multiple forces. So we say that the basically the British imperial strategy, okay, that was seeing Palestine as a key foothold between Egypt, Suez, and India, okay, and for them, in the British political mind, if this land of Palestine is populated by a group of potentially loyal people to Britain, this will strategically place Britain in a very favorable place in, you know, like in the world map. But don't forget that the main reason was there was a Christian resentment towards Jews, okay, for both economic, okay, and religious reasons. And it was actually some sort of a generous offer for someone to come and offer that they will take all the Jews out of Europe for good, okay? So we're going to put an end for 10 centuries of suffering for both ends. Let us just have this divorce, okay? Let us divorce. Let's everyone just go in a different way. We couldn't live together for 10 centuries, okay? Now let's put an end of this. So of course the Christians, okay, whether it was politicians, whether it was actually the population there, they saw this as a good idea. And to be honest, we don't know who really cared about where did they go or where did they end up. All what they cared about is just like, let's get rid of them, okay? That the Europeans also had this geopolitical interest when they saw that Palestine can be a safeguard for the Western influence in the Middle East. These three reasons came together, plus another very important factor that is going to be a segue for us to talk about Christian Zionism. All right, so Christian Zionism was already rooted, okay, in the dispensationalist theology among a group of Protestant Christians called the evangelicals, okay? And those groups, they had some sort of a religious belief that they considered the restoration of Jews to Palestine as a religious duty tied to the end of time events, or between quotations, eschatology. So all these factors came together, all supported this Zionist project of Theodor Herzl. Nobody really cared about the inhabitants of the land of Palestine at that time, because everyone was looking at this project from a very Machiavelli, you know, point of view, just saying basically that ends justifying means. And if we're going to be gaining something out of this, let us just support it. So there was no moral consideration, no humane consideration about the people who were the inhabitants of this land. Everyone received this idea and supported it because everyone saw this as fulfilling some sort of either economic or religious or geopolitical interest of their own. So 1917, Balfour Declaration supported the Jewish homeland in Palestine. In 1948, it was the official declaration or establishment of the State of Israel.
So I hope by the end of this video that you have came to the conclusion about the term anti-Semitism. Okay, so it's up to you to judge if this sort of resentment and this sort of tension that was between the Christians and Jews was actually due to racial issues, or it was due to some sort of religious plus economic reasons that led to those 10 centuries of tension between these two religious groups. So I hope also that you have came to the conclusion of the validity of the term Judeo-Christian. That is a term that's been often used by some of the Christian politicians and thinkers, as well as the Jewish politicians and thinkers. I'll leave it to you to make your judgment. I hope that I have made it clear as much as I can. In the next episode, we are going to be talking about Christian Zionism. This is one of the main forces combined with the other three forces that we've shown, which were basically religious plus ideological plus also economic and geopolitical. All these forces came together, but Christian Zionism was something that was already there, okay? And it happened that all these forces came together and they all saw some sort of benefit of supporting this Zionist project by establishing this so-called State of Israel and the land of Palestine. And the rest of is history. In the next episode, we'll be talking at length about Christian Zionism and also about Christianity. So please, if you like this video, give us a like, leave a comment to know that you have passed from here. And until I see you in the next episode, have a good day.